September 11th, 1987. Cowlitz County, Washington. The dismembered headless torso of a woman is discovered in the Lewis River, and the same victim's legs are soon found in the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon. 13 days later, the body of an infant girl who is believed to be the woman's daughter is found in the Cowlitz River, but both victims remain Jane Does. In 2006, the decedents are finally identified as 24-year-old Raj Narain, who originally hailed from Fiji, and her 14-month American-born daughter, Kamnee. It turns out that Raj's 30-year-old husband, Ashok Narain, went missing around the same time the murders took place, but since he cannot be found, the crime is never solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a very unusual story involving two unsolved murders and a disappearance. The 1987 saga of the Narain family. I was recently looking back through my lengthy list of case suggestions and saw that I had received a request to cover this one over 7 years ago by a listener named Megan. I had never really delved into it, but while browsing through the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit a few weeks ago, I saw that a poster under the username Quirky Motor had done an extensive write-up about this case, and it instantly rang a bell for me and got me sucked down into a rabbit hole. I'm always fascinated by stories in which one half of a couple is murdered and the other goes missing, and there's ambiguity about whether the missing spouse was the perpetrator or an additional victim. And what makes this particular story even more bizarre and tragic is that the couple's infant daughter was also killed. Ashok and Raj Narain both hailed from the island nation of Fiji, and after they relocated to the United States and settled in Eugene, Oregon, they had a 14-month-old daughter named Kamnee. However, at some point in 1987, their respective families seemed to lose touch with them, and it would be 2 decades before any sort of missing persons investigation was performed. It turned out that Raj's dismembered torso and legs and Kamnee's body were each discovered in 3 separate rivers in Oregon and Washington state, but neither of them were identified until 2006. And to this day, no trace of Ashok Narain has ever been found. One possible theory is that Ashok murdered his wife and daughter and disposed of their remains before fleeing the area. Raj happened to be 2 months pregnant with her second child at the time of her death, but as far as anyone could tell, there did not appear to be any noticeable problems in the Narain's marriage. It's been reported that Ashok may have continued living in Oregon in the months following the murders, but I'm not sure if this was ever officially confirmed, and while Ashok is wanted by law enforcement for questioning, he has not been charged with any crime. Therefore, we cannot discount the possibility that the entire family was murdered by an unknown third party, and Ashok's remains have just never been found. Whatever the case, this is still a very odd story, so we're going to look at all the different sides on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the saga of the Narain family. Our story begins in Cowlitz County, Washington in 1987. On the morning of September the 11th, 3 fishermen were boating on the North Fork of the Lewis River outside the town of Woodland, which is located just east of the Washington-Oregon state line. They wound up coming across a dismembered torso which was clinging to some rocks in shallow water about 3/4 of a mile downstream from the Interstate 5 bridge. The victim appeared to be a dark-skinned woman who was missing her head and both of her legs, so the fishermen contacted the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office. After the torso was recovered, scuba divers and a tracking dog were brought in to search the river and the surrounding area, but they failed to turn up any additional body parts. An autopsy was performed on the victim by a pathologist who believed that she was Hispanic or Native American. She was estimated to be between the ages of 19 and 25, approximately 5'3" and 110 pounds, and she had no scars or tattoos. The torso was clad in a sheer pink 2-piece teddy nightgown made of nylon, blue-green Hanes brand underwear, 2 silver bangle bracelets, and her fingernails and toenails were also painted red. However, the most surprising discovery was that the woman was 2 months pregnant and had likely given birth on at least one previous occasion. While the woman's exact cause of death could not be determined, the medical examiner suspected that it may have been asphyxiation or head trauma. He ruled that she had been the victim of a homicide and estimated that she had been dead for about a week before she was discovered. Well, on September the 13th, 2 days after the discovery of the torso, the upper portion of a woman's leg was discovered across the state line, floating in the Willamette River just south of the Steel Bridge in downtown Portland, Oregon. The spot was over 30 miles south from where the torso was found, but since the leg was dark-skinned and appeared to be dismembered, the authorities immediately suspected that it belonged to the same victim. Well, sure enough, a matching dark-skinned woman's leg was found in the same area of the Willamette River the following day, and both legs were a positive match to the torso. Since the Lewis and Willamette Rivers did not flow into each other, it appeared that someone had made a calculated effort to dismember the victim and toss her body parts into different rivers. But even though both these rivers were extensively searched, the woman's head was never recovered. Investigators attempted to cross-check the victim with all missing persons reports involving young women from the area with her description. They even consulted with the Green River Task Force to see if she might have been a victim of the notorious Green River Killer, who was terrorizing the Pacific Northwest during this time period and would not be identified as Gary Ridgway for another 14 years. While fingerprints were taken from the woman, they did not match anyone in any of the criminal databases. In the end, she could not be identified and remained a Jane Doe. Well, the story became even stranger on September the 24th after another shocking discovery was made by a man who was fishing on the east bank of the Cowlitz River, less than a mile south of the Tenant-Way Bridge near Kelso, Washington, another town located near the Washington-Oregon state line. The fisherman said that he noticed an object bobbing among some debris in the water against a log, which was 6 feet from shore, but while he initially thought that it was a stuffed animal, he soon realized it was actually the badly decomposed body of a dark-skinned baby girl. After he contacted the Kelso Police Department, they recovered the body from the river, though they were unable to turn up any additional evidence in the area. When the medical examiner performed an autopsy on the child, he estimated that she was between 18 to 24 months old, weighed approximately 25 pounds, and was 31 inches long. She was clad in a black and red shirt with black, blue, and white stripes, pink terry cloth shorts, plastic pants, and a cotton diaper with pink safety pins on the outside. Based on the level of decomposition, it was estimated that the child had been in the water for around 3 to 4 weeks, and it was possible that she was originally dumped into the Columbia River, which was located only a half-mile away, and then pushed into the Cowlitz River by the incoming tide. She had clearly been the victim of a homicide, as she received a fatal blow to the head which fractured her skull behind her right ear. It was believed that the girl was either of Hispanic or Native American descent, so of course, there was immediate speculation that she was the daughter of the adult Jane Doe whose torso had been found in the Lewis River just 19 miles away. But of course, since there was no DNA testing back in 1987, it could not be conclusively proven that the woman and the child were genetically related. Much like the adult Jane Doe, there were no missing children's reports on file for anyone matching her description, so she could also not be identified and became known as Baby Jane Doe. Since the Cowlitz River did not flow into either the Lewis or Willamette rivers, this indicated that if the woman and the child were both murdered by the same person, they made a calculated decision to dispose of their remains in different bodies of water, though the one thing that all these three rivers had in common is that they were close to Interstate 5. On October the 8th, a man fishing along the west bank of the Cowlitz River near the town of Castle Rock discovered a bedsheet which contained traces of blood, human hair, and animal hair, but forensic testing showed that the blood belonged to a deer, so the bedsheet could not be linked to either of the victims. Since there was no one to claim them, the remains of Jane Doe and baby Jane Doe would be buried side by side in unmarked graves at Longview Memorial Park. For the next several years, law enforcement would explore a number of different leads in an attempt to identify the two victims and wondered if they might have been undocumented immigrants from Canada or Mexico. By the time the 21st century rolled around, DNA profiling had become a major tool in helping identify John and Jane Does, but the problem is that the original tissue samples which were taken from the two victims had become too degraded for forensic testing. At the time, the local authorities did not have the budget to exhume the bodies in order to extract new DNA evidence, so they were hoping to secure the necessary funding in order to do so. Obviously, since the adult Jane Doe's head was never recovered, a composite sketch could not be created for her face, but forensic artist David Wood was able to create a new sketch for baby Jane Doe based on her original morgue photo. In February of 2003, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer published some articles about cold cases from the area as part of their Without a Trace series. One of these articles shined a spotlight on the two unidentified decedents and featured the updated composite sketch of baby Jane Doe. Well, 3 years later, in April of 2006, this article would capture the attention of a man named Jay Prasad, who lived with his family in Sydney, Australia. Jay originally hailed from Fiji, an island country located in the South Pacific Ocean northeast of New Zealand, and he was one of 11 siblings in a large Indo-Fijian family who resided on Viti Levu, Fiji's largest island. The Prasads had lived together in a metal shack on a 10-acre farm located in the small village of Balavu and were so poor that they could not even afford blankets and slept in plastic sacks. When Jay saw the composite sketch of baby Jane Doe, he immediately felt that she bore a striking resemblance to his niece, Kamnee Kushal Narain, as Jay's younger sister, Raj Prasad Narain, was Kamnee's mother. Jay was particularly intrigued by the fact that baby Jane Doe had been found wearing a cotton diaper which was fastened by pink safety pins, as this was a Fijian tradition. Jay soon contacted the Kelso Police Department and expressed his belief that Raj and Kamnee were Jane Doe and baby Jane Doe, as he claimed he had not seen or heard from either of them in 2 decades. Raj was one half of a pair of twins who were born on May 15, 1963, though tragically, her twin died only 6 weeks later. Since Raj was the youngest sibling in the family, she was given the nickname Lali, which is Hindi for little daughter. Even though Raj's father died when she was young and she was forced to grow up in poverty, she was described as having a happy childhood and a close relationship with her siblings. Shortly after Raj was born, a new high school was constructed in the area, which meant that she was one of the first members of her family who got the opportunity to learn how to read and write and speak English. In 1983, Raj was arranged to be married to her husband, Ashok Narain, who was 6.5 years older than her. Ashok had also grown up in Bolavu, but left Fiji to relocate to the United States, where he worked as a tailor and lived in a squatter settlement in Nassau, Washington. After returning to Fiji, Ashok asked Raj's family for permission to marry her, and since he had been close friends with some of her brothers, they gladly provided their blessing. Their wedding ceremony took place on the Prasad family farm, and appropriately enough, Raj's brother Jay had gotten married to his own wife in another ceremony which was held on the farm the previous day. 9 months later, Ashok decided that he wanted to return to the United States to start a new life there with Raj, and this marked the first time that anyone from the Prasad family had ever left the island of Viti Levu. After they arrived, the couple moved into a downtown apartment in Eugene, Oregon, and one of Raj's brothers sent them money to purchase their first car, a white 1980 Toyota Tercel. Since long-distance phone calls were too expensive, Raj stayed in touch with her family by writing them letters, and since her mother was illiterate, Raj recorded audio tapes to send to her. Based on what she wrote in her letters, it seemed like Raj spent most of her time watching television in her apartment and tending to her husband, but she never gave off the impression that she was unhappy or that there were any issues in her marriage. On June the 29th, 1986, Raj gave birth to her daughter Kamnee and sent her family a photograph of the child, though they never got the chance to meet her in person. However, sometime in 1987, Raj's letters seemed to come to a halt, though her family was not overly concerned since they figured that she had become very occupied with raising her daughter. But things reached the point where the Prasads completely lost touch with Raj, Ashok, and Kamnee and had no idea what happened to them. Tragically, Raj's mother passed away in 1997 after not having heard from her daughter or granddaughter in 10 years. By 2006, Jay Prasad had relocated from Fiji to Australia, and after his children taught him how to use the internet, Jay attempted to see if he could search for information about his sister. At one point, Jay contacted the FBI to see if he could officially report Raj missing, but since they had no information to work with, they suggested he hire a private investigator instead. Well, the big turning point occurred when Jay saw the aforementioned article from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which featured the composite sketch of baby Jane Doe, as Jay felt that the child had a striking resemblance to the photograph of Kamnee, which Raj had mailed her family. Once he learned the details of how the adult Jane Doe and the baby Jane Doe were found, Jay wondered if the two victims might be Raj and Kamnee, as their deaths seemed to coincide with the time period when the Prasad family stopped hearing from them. Jay was also struck by the fact that the adult Jane Doe had been found with painted fingernails and toenails and was wearing silver bangle bracelets, as Raj liked to paint her nails and wear these items. When Jay got in touch with the Kelso Police Department and shared this information, they were initially skeptical of the story, but Jay took the initiative to travel all the way from Australia to Washington in order to meet with them. Jay willingly provided a sample of his DNA, and Interpol would later assist with collecting additional DNA samples from some of Raj's other siblings in Fiji and Australia. Well, during the same time period this was going on, the Kelso Police Department was also contacted by a man named Raj Narain, who lived in Woodland, California, and also happened to be Ashok's brother. Robert had also seen the 2003 article from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and felt that baby Jane Doe had a resemblance to his niece, Kamnee. Much like Jay, Robert confirmed that he had not seen or heard from Ashok, Raj, and Kamnee for 2 decades. Based on this information, a decision was finally made in September of that year to finally exhume the bodies of the 2 unidentified victims in order to extract new samples of their DNA. Even though a DNA comparison had not yet been made, Jay was so convinced that Jane Doe and baby Jane Doe were his sister and niece that he appeared at their gravesite at Longview Memorial Park in order to hold a small ceremony. He provided the 2 victims with new burial clothes and laid 2 bunches of red roses on the adult Jane Doe's grave and a dozen blood-red carnations on baby Jane Doe's grave, along with a note which read, quote, "You will always be remembered, and I am here with a promise that I will bring you home," end quote. Well, on September the 25th, 2007, the authorities publicly announced that DNA testing had confirmed a genetic connection between the 2 decedents and the Prasad family, so they were positively identified as Raj and Kamnee Narain. This meant that Raj had been 24 years of age and Kamnee was 14 months old at the time they were killed. It turned out that their official identification had been made 2 months after the exhumation, but investigators asked the Prasad family to keep the DNA results private for an entire year. They were hoping to find out if Ashok Narain was still alive somewhere and track him down, which is why they did not want to go public with the results and possibly tip him off. However, all attempts to find Ashok were unsuccessful. We'll talk more about this later on, but details are murky about whether or not it could be confirmed that Ashok was still alive after September of 1987, which is when Raj and Kamnee were murdered, but many sources out there state that Ashok was last seen during the spring of 1988. Chief Criminal Deputy Charlie Rosenzweig of the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office, who was one of the officers who found Raj's torso in the Lewis River, stated during an interview that they had uncovered information that Ashok was still living and working in Eugene in the months following the discovery of his wife and daughter's bodies, but he never attempted to contact the authorities to report them missing. Ashok supposedly disappeared from the area in the spring of 1988, and his family's car, a white 1980 Toyota Tercel with Oregon license plates KUV 762, was also never recovered, even though its registration expired in 1993. The Washington State Police confirmed that they managed to track down and contact every single Ashok Narain who is listed as living in Washington, Oregon, and California, but they all turned out to be completely different men who just happened to have the same name. Following the announcement of Raj and Kamnee's identifications, Jay was granted permission to transport the remains to Fiji, so on October the 17th, they were exhumed and placed in a single coffin together, with Raj holding Kamnee in her arms, as Jay said he did not want them to be separated again. After the coffin was transported to Vidi Levu, a traditional Hindu burial ceremony was held by the Prasad family, which was attended by over 500 mourners, and Raj and Kamnee were subsequently cremated before their ashes were scattered at sea. Jay used $5,000 of his own money to start the Raj and Kamnee Memorial Trust Fund, an educational scholarship for girls in rural Fiji, as he hoped it would eventually help pave the way to allowing them the opportunity to support their families independently. Jay also made separate $2,500 donations to a pair of girls' orphanages in the area. Now that Raj and Kamnee had been returned home, the new priority was attempting to figure out what happened to Ashok. Articles seeking information about his whereabouts were published in Fijian, South Asian, and Canadian newspapers on the chance that he was now living in an area with a large Indian or Indo-Fijian community. In August of 2011, Jay was interviewed for an article about this case in the Fiji Times and revealed some new pieces of information. Jay claimed that he had been informed by the Fiji Immigration Department that a man named Ashok Narain had entered the country on May 12, 1988, around the same time period he was supposedly last seen in Oregon, but they have no record of this person ever having left. It's never been conclusively established if this was the same Ashok Narain, and even if he was, it's also possible that he could have departed Fiji at some point under a false name. Jay also revealed that he had been told by some of Ashok's family members that Kamnee had to undergo heart surgery in Oregon, but since her parents were unable to pay her medical bills, they were forced to move to another state as a means of escaping it. However, Jay said he later discovered this story was false and had only been shared with his family as a means to prevent them from trying to contact Raj. According to Jay, he once used the website peoplesearch.com to try and find out Ashok's last known address. He was given an address from California, but when Jay informed the authorities about this, they discovered that Ashok's brother Robert actually lived at this address. Jay also said that he uncovered a lease from California, which had been signed by Ashok in 1990, but when the FBI examined it, they concluded that the signature was forged, and the document also contained the name of a law firm which did not exist. Unfortunately, no further details have been provided to elaborate on Jay's claims. Ashok is currently listed in the National Crime Information Center database as a missing person and has not been named as a suspect or person of interest in the murders of his wife and daughter. While he has never been charged with any crime, he is still wanted for questioning. Fiji does have an extradition treaty with the United States, but if Ashok is discovered to be living there, he would be under no obligation to speak with investigators or return to America until charges are filed. At the time he was last confirmed to be alive, Ashok was 1 month shy of his 31st birthday, and if he is still out there somewhere today, he would be turning 69 years old just a few weeks after this episode's release. But Ashok's whereabouts are still unknown, and the murders of Raj and Kamnee remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So like I mentioned during the intro, I'm always fascinated by cases in which one half of a couple is murdered and the other goes missing at the same time, but there's ambiguity about whether the missing victim was complicit in the murder and ran away, or if they were actually killed by an unknown party who disposed of their body. I've covered a few examples of this type of case on the podcast, such as the 1993 murder of Latricia White and the simultaneous disappearance of her boyfriend, Lee Dub Walkerhagen, and Dub's son, Chance Walkerhagen, which was featured all the way back on episode number 39. Another example of this was the 1992 murder of Larry Costine and the simultaneous disappearance of his girlfriend, Melissa Jo Sermons, as I explored that case on episode number 315. At the outset of both these investigations, there was speculation that the missing spouse was responsible for the murder and hiding out somewhere, but now that 3 decades have passed and no evidence has been found to indicate they're still alive, the consensus from law enforcement in both cases is that the murders were likely committed by a third party. Another similar case from the Pacific Northwest, which I covered back on episode number 28, was the 1985 murder of Diana Robertson, who was killed in a remote wooded area of Pierce County, Washington, during an outing with her boyfriend, Mike Reamer, and their 2-year-old daughter, Crystal. Crystal was later found abandoned at a Kmart after being dropped off there by an unknown party, and since Mike could not be found and had a history of domestic violence, it was initially suspected that he murdered Diana before driving his daughter to a public place. However, in 2011, a portion of Mike's skull was found in the same wooded area near where Diana was killed, and while his cause of death could not be determined, it now seems like there's a good chance that the couple was murdered by an unknown party who decided to abandon Crystal at the Kmart because they didn't want to harm a child. Well, it's now been 38 years since Raj and Kamnee Narain were murdered and Ashok Narain disappeared, but what differentiates this case from the other examples I've cited is that Raj and Kamnee remained unidentified Jane Does for 2 decades. If a proper missing persons investigation had been performed in 1987, I think the authorities would have had a better idea of whether Ashok was the perpetrator or an additional victim, but nobody even started looking into this until 2006. According to many sources you'll find out there, Ashok was believed to have been living and working in Eugene, Oregon until the spring of 1988, and if this is accurate, then I'd say it's pretty cut and dried that he murdered Raj and Kamnee. If they were both killed by an outside party, why wouldn't Ashok have attempted to contact the authorities? But has it been conclusively established that Ashok was still alive in the months following his wife and daughter's deaths? Apparently, when Ashok's brother Robert contacted the authorities to report him missing in 2006, he listed the last date of contact as April 1st, 1988, but since 18 years had passed by that point, can we be certain he was remembering things correctly? If you go to Ashok's profile page at NamUs, it actually lists his date of last contact as January 1st, 1987. When NamUs is unsure of the exact date that someone went missing or was murdered, it's common practice for them to use January 1st as their placeholder date, but is there a reason they selected 1987 instead of 1988? What's also interesting is that Raj has a profile page at NamUs, which lists September 7th, 1987 as her date of last contact, even though her torso was discovered in the Lewis River on September 11th of that year. Does this mean the investigation uncovered information which showed that September 7th was the last date Raj was confirmed to be alive? If so, is there any hard evidence that Ashok was still alive after that date? All I know for certain is that Ashok has not been charged with any crime or been named as a suspect or person of interest, as he is only wanted for questioning at this point. But if Ashok did murder Raj and Kamnee and went on the run and established a new life somewhere, he had a 2-decade head start. Now, the impression I've gotten from interviews I've seen with Raj's brother Jay is that he has his suspicions about Ashok, but no one from their family has ever directly accused Ashok of killing her and Kamnee. After all, Ashok was good friends with some of Raj's brothers, and they gave him his blessing to marry her, so it does not appear that they ever saw any noticeable red flags with Ashok or had any reason to believe he would harm Raj. Of course, during the last 3 years of her life, none of Raj's family members got to see her in person, as after Raj and Ashok relocated from Fiji to the United States, she exclusively communicated with them via letters and audio recordings. It sounds like Raj never gave off the impression that there were any issues in the marriage, but if she was having problems with Ashok, would she have told her family about them? Well, unfortunately, Fiji has been cited as a country that has one of the highest rates of domestic violence against women in the world, as in 2021, the Fiji Women's Crisis Center publicly announced that they were facing a quote-unquote crisis within a crisis, as the COVID-19 lockdowns had caused a 300% increase in domestic violence-related calls on their helpline due to the fact that victimized women were now trapped with their abusive partners, which only caused tensions to escalate. Now, since there has never been any official confirmation of domestic violence in the Narain's marriage, this is all based on pure speculation, but when Raj moved to the United States with her husband, it marked the first time that anyone from her family had ever left the island of Viti Levu. For all we know, Raj may have been raised to believe that domestic violence was a taboo subject, so if Ashok abused or mistreated her, cultural differences could have prevented her from saying anything about it to her family. The issue is that we don't seem to have any independent eyewitnesses who can report what the Narain's marriage was like during their time living in Eugene, Oregon. The impression that Raj's family got from her letters is that she spent most of her time in her apartment watching television and tending to her husband and her daughter after she was born, but I have no idea if Raj had any real friends or acquaintances. It's been reported that before he married Raj, Ashok had previously lived in Washington State and worked as a tailor, but I don't know what he did for a living during their time in Eugene, or what kind of social circle he had. Was Ashok still working his job and hanging out with friends during the time period between when Raj and Kamnee were murdered during the fall of 1987, and he supposedly disappeared from the area during the spring of 1988? Hell, what about the apartment the couple were living in? Did Ashok formally give notice and leave his apartment in 1988? Was he evicted? Or did the entire family just disappear without explanation? We know that Kamnee was 14 months old and Raj was 2 months pregnant at the time they were killed, but were they regularly seeing a doctor at that time before they abruptly stopped? Another thing I'm curious about is the Narain's immigration situation. None of the sources I've seen say that the family was in the United States illegally, but if they were, could this have prevented Ashok from contacting the authorities, even if he was completely innocent and had no involvement in his wife and daughter's deaths? Unfortunately, we don't know the answers to any of these questions, but I do know that no one ever reported Raj and Kamnee missing during that time period. And even though the discovery of their bodies got quite a bit of coverage in the Oregon and Washington media, no one ever came forward to say that the victims might be them. I don't know the couple's financial situation at that time, but I'm guessing they did not have a lot of money, as they lived in a small apartment and one of Raj's brothers had to give them the funds to purchase a car. If raising Kamnee was causing them a lot of financial struggles, then it's possible that Ashok was less than thrilled to discover that Raj was pregnant again, and this could have been the trigger that caused things to escalate into murder. Another odd detail is that the family's vehicle, a white 1980 Toyota Tercel, was never recovered, but since Raj's dismembered torso, her legs, and Kamnee's body were each found in 3 separate rivers which aren't connected to each other, you can definitely rule out the possibility of the entire family being killed after crashing their car into a body of water. But of course, this doesn't rule out the idea of Ashok driving the Tercel into a body of water on his own, either accidentally or otherwise. Or alternatively, perhaps someone else murdered Ashok and dumped his body and the car into a river, and they are still submerged somewhere to this day. I find it interesting that Raj's torso was clad in a pink 2-piece teddy nightgown, which might indicate that she was murdered while she was sleeping. This is certainly a detail that could point towards her being a victim of intimate partner violence, unless a third party murdered the entire family in their apartment while they were sleeping. But again, we don't know anything about what ultimately happened to the Narain's apartment after the family disappeared. Obviously, since Raj's body was dismembered, a huge mess would have been created that required a major cleanup, but if the Narain's apartment featured any obvious signs that foul play had occurred there, no one informed the authorities about it. But if Ashok remained in the area until the spring of 1988, several months after the murders took place, he would have had plenty of time to cover his tracks if he was responsible. So to recap, Raj's legs were found in the Willamette River in Portland, her torso was discovered across the state line in the Lewis River in Washington State, about 30 miles north of there, and Kamnee's body was floating in the Cowlitz River, about 19 miles north of the Lewis River. And since Raj's head was never found, it very well could have been disposed of at an entirely different location. Since none of these 3 rivers flowed into each other, the the responsible party made a calculated decision to dispose of these remains in different bodies of water. Portland is also located 110 miles north of Eugene, so if Raj and Kamnee were murdered in their apartment, the perpetrator had to travel a great distance in order to do this, and they probably used Interstate 5 since it was in close proximity to all the rivers. Again, since Ashok was never found, we cannot discount the possibility that he was murdered too, and his remains were disposed of at an altogether different location, but if he really was continuing to live and work in Eugene until the spring of 1988, it definitely would have been in his best interest to ensure that his wife and daughter's remains were disposed of and spread out at faraway locations. And if that was his strategy, I guess it technically worked, since no one ever put two and two together. If Ashok was a family annihilator who got rid of his pregnant wife and daughter because he considered them to be a financial burden, he may have decided to remain in Eugene for several months out of necessity in order to save up enough money to relocate. Now, Jay Prasad would later claim during an interview that there was a record of an Ashok Kumar Narain entering Fiji on May 12, 1988, but there's no record of anyone by that name ever having left the country since then. Obviously, this would correspond with the time period when Ashok was believed to have disappeared from Eugene, and since no one was even aware that Ashok or his family was missing or had been murdered at that point, he wouldn't have had any issues traveling internationally. But the problem is that we can't even be certain if this is the same Ashok Kumar Narain, as it's not a particularly uncommon name. In fact, if you do a Google search on Ashok Narain, you're going to find a ton of matches for a number of different people. But if Ashok did return to Fiji and never left there, would he have been able to spend the past 4 decades living under the radar? I know that this case didn't start getting media coverage until 2006, but Fiji isn't exactly a large place, and I haven't heard of any reported sightings of him there. Jay claimed that Ashok's side of the family once told him that Kamnee had heart surgery and they were forced to flee the state in order to avoid paying the medical bills. I know that Kamnee was killed by a blow to the head which fractured her skull, but I think that if she had any heart issues or had underwent surgery prior to her death, that would have been easy to verify. This is why Jay has implied that Ashok's family fed him a false story to prevent him from searching for Raj and Kamnee, which, if true, would indicate that they knew Ashok had done something and were trying to protect him. However, it's worth noting that around the same time that Jay read the Seattle Post-Intelligencer article about the Jane Does and took the initiative to contact the Kelso Police Department, Ashok's brother Robert also came across the article and did the same thing to report that his family hadn't heard from Ashok in 2 decades. If Ashok's family knew he was alive and were helping him hide out, then I'm not sure why Robert would have done that. I know that when Jay attempted to use peoplesearch.com to track down Ashok, it wound up leading him to an address in California where Robert had lived, but these websites are not always accurate and can often provide outdated or incorrect data, so I'm not sure I take that as an indication that Ashok was hiding out in California after killing his family. But it is bizarre that Jay claimed that he uncovered a lease from California which had Ashok's forged signature and the name of a non-existent law firm on it. I wish I had more context about this, because how can Jay be certain that this isn't a document containing the signature for another person named Ashok Narain? But if Ashok is no longer alive today, we still need to explore the possibility of him winding up dead around the same time that his wife and daughter did. During the intro to this episode, I made mention of an extensive write-up about this case at the Unresolved Mystery subreddit, which was done by a poster under the username Quirky Motor, who says they have submitted the names of 2 unidentified John Does found in Washington state during the 1980s that look like they could be potential matches to Ashok. One of these victims was a decomposed man found on the side of Highway 123 near Mount Rainier on September 26, 1987, about 90 miles northeast of Kelso. It was estimated that the victim was between 20 to 30 years old, and while his cause of death could not be determined, he had been deceased approximately 2 weeks before he was found, which would coincide with when Raj and Kamnee were murdered. Based on the condition of his teeth, there was speculation that the John Doe had never been to a dentist before, which would make sense for Ashok since he grew up in a small village in Fiji. thus far, I'm not sure if DNA has ever been extracted from this decedent. The second potential candidate was a John Doe whose decomposing body was found floating in the Willamette River between the Morrison and Hawthorne bridges in Portland, Oregon on May 26, 1988. Since the victim was completely unrecognizable, they have a very wide estimated age range of between 15 to 40 years old, and even though he had a skull fracture in the left temporal area, their cause and time of death is unknown. Of course, Raj's legs were discovered in the Willamette River only about 2 miles away from where the John Doe was found, but other than the locations and the time period, there really isn't anything distinctive about either of these victims to indicate they might be Ashok. And even if one of the John Does did turn out to be Ashok, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was murdered by a third party, as his death could have been a suicide, which was brought on by what he did to his wife and daughter. Regardless, I'm still glad these decedents have been submitted as potential matches for Ashok, because even if these tips don't pan out, both John Does might have loved ones out there who miss them, so they deserve to get their names back. I guess my big issue with the idea of the entire family being murdered by a third party is that I just don't know who'd have had a motive to do this. Like I mentioned earlier, we have so few details about what the Narains' lives were like during their time in Eugene, as all we really know is what Raj shared in her correspondence with her family, and I have no idea if law enforcement has been able to turn up additional information. Even if Raj and or Ashok made some enemies, who would go so far as to murder a 14-month-old infant girl? During the early stages of the investigation, the authorities explored the possibility that the then unidentified Green River killer might have been responsible for these crimes, but we now know that Gary Ridgway liked to target sex workers and runaways, and I don't see him harming an infant. Given the circumstances, the most logical explanation is that this was a domestic homicide committed by a man who no longer wanted the burden of a pregnant wife and a small child. But at the same time, the fact that law enforcement has never formally charged Ashok or named him as a suspect in these murders makes me think that they are still unsure about whether he was a perpetrator or a victim. All my theorizing about domestic violence is just speculation, since it has never been conclusively established if Ashok was violent or abusive, so he is technically still innocent until proven guilty. If it has been proven that Ashok was still alive and living in the area after Raj and Kamnee were murdered in September of 1987, that looks pretty damning, but until law enforcement officially reclassifies Ashok from a missing person to a wanted fugitive, I will keep an open mind. If there's a silver lining to this story, it's that after being buried in unmarked graves for 2 decades, Raj and Kamnee were ultimately identified and their family got to receive answers about what happened and bring them back to Fiji. But their loved ones will never achieve a complete resolution until they find out who killed them and why. If Ashok Narain is still alive today, he will be turning 69 years old a few weeks after this episode's release, so if he was not a victim, there is still a possibility of him facing justice. So if you happen to have any information about the murders of Raj and Kamnee Narain, as well as the current whereabouts of Ashok Narain, there are 3 different investigative agencies listed that you can contact. There's the Kelso Police Department at 360-423-1270. That's 360-423-1270. There's the Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office at 360-577-3092. That's 360-577-3092. And there's also the Eugene Police Department at 541-682-5111. That's 541-682-5111. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about Robert Weeks, a serial killer who was believed to be responsible for the murders of at least 4 victims whose remains were never found, and has the distinction of being the subject of the very first case from Unsolved Mysteries to ever be solved. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chili, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, traveled to the United Kingdom to discuss the unexplained 1976 death of Peter Watts, who was killed under mysterious circumstances after making a trip from his hometown in Wales to London. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which could be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 80 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Joshua F., Sarah B.M., and Craig T.F. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which, like I said, has a very interesting write-up about this case. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.